Hello, I'm Jan Ślewiński, welcoming you to another edition of World Today. Poland remembers the victims of the Katyń massacre, one of the most heinous crimes of Stalinism. The path of thousands of prisoners of war ended with execution and mass graves. But the story of the massacre itself continued, with years of lies and deception. Tonight, we'll delve deeper into the Soviet atrocities and their legacy today.
On the day of remembrance of the victims of the Katyn massacre, Polish President Andrzej Duda called for the commemoration of Polish victims and condemnation of the current war in Ukraine. April 13th marks the anniversary of the discovery of mass graves of Polish officers in Katyń forest, Russia, murdered by the secret police of the Soviet Union in 1940.
Pamiętamy też dlatego, żeby coś takiego nigdy więcej się nie powtórzyło.
We also remember this crime to ensure that nothing like it will happen again. We are terrified looking at the east, all these documents or video materials or photos from Bucha and other places in Russian-occupied Ukraine, where people were murdered in the same way, in the Katyń way.
By killing Polish officers, the Soviets wanted to erase the country from the map of Europe, as well as wanted to prevent its revival. Throughout the course of communist Poland, the Soviets denied their responsibility for the crime, claiming that it was committed by Nazi Germany in 1941. It was not until 1990 that the Soviet Union admitted responsibility for the massacre. The Day of Remembrance of the Victims of the Katyn massacre was established by the Polish Parliament on the 14th of November 2007.
So, how did the Katyń massacre influence Poland's history, and what lessons can be drawn from this tragic event today? We'll be examining the impact of Soviet wartime atrocities with our guests tonight. Paweł Żurkowski, Director of the Polish Army Museum, and David Engels, historian from the Western Institute. Good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening.
So, let us begin, and we should probably begin with the origins of this war crime. How did it come about initially? What were the causes of this tragedy?
For me, I am conceived that this beginning of it took place in the lost Soviet Bolshevik War of 1920, because it was that time and the effect of the lost war that conceived Stalin and the Bolsheviks in general that the core of the Polish defense in that war was based on the Polish intellectual elite. Of course, the workers, the peasants filled the ranks of the army. And they decided that it was a strong military force. However, the determined fighting and planning, effective boosting of the morale was based on the Polish intellectuals. And in 1940, when thousands of them fall in hands of the Soviets, I think it was remembered that they could to make strong resistance against the Bolsheviks' plans against the Poland and Europe in general.
So they had the capacity to ensure continuing resistance, right? Now, David Engels, can this be described not just as Stalin's revenge for what happened back in 1920, but also as a plan that has all the hallmarks of genocidal thinking? Basically something that was intended to decapitate a nation, to destroy its elites, and to make sure that following a potentially victorious war, one that would be victorious for the Soviet Union, Poland would not be able to rise again.
Yeah, absolutely. We have to see that in this context, and even more so as exactly at the same time we also have the German massacres also of the Polish intelligentsia. Think about the Intelligenzaktion that happens more or less at the same time, just on the other side of the border. So this is a fruit, of course, of the social engineering idea as it rose since the French Revolution, when wars were not fought just between equal nations, but essentially about annexing others, assimilating them. And that led, of course, to the massacre of entire classes of population or of races. So that is something that has very far roots, but that found its absolute apogee in the 1940s, and that culminated, at least from a Polish perspective, in these atrocious events of Katyn.
Now, Paweł Żurkowski, looking at this from today's perspective, we obviously mentioned the Katyń massacre, but this was not the only time when communist crimes, Soviet crimes, have claimed the lives of the very best Poland had to offer, right?
Right. This is a kind of a label to popularize the events, as it could be called. However, the Katyn was not only in 1940. It was the Kharkov, it was the Tver, and the massive graves in Piatychatki or Miednoje. You should remember that other executions took place in other smaller places, sometimes in local prisons, and we should remember in 1937 Polish operation, which was aimed at the Soviet citizens of the Polish origin, just straight that they were Polish. And for example, in 1941, when the Red Army retreated before the attacking Germans, it was again that in some prisons there were massive executions of the prisoners just because they were prisoners suspected of the anti-Soviet movement.
So once again, we can see a pattern emerging here, and unfortunately a pattern that continued later on. Now, joining us also today is Mark Kramer from the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies, Harvard University, professor and director of Cold War Studies Department. Hello and welcome to TVP World. So we've been examining the origins of the Katyń massacre, but also this particular event was not only about the war crimes themselves, it was also about the Western reactions. Now, can you tell us more about the way Western countries responded to the news of this massacre and how it was treated later on throughout the 20th century by Western powers?
Yes, there were large quantities of particularly U.S. and British intelligence documents declassified about 13 years ago on the 70th anniversary of the massacres. And those documents show that both U.S. and British governments understood early on that this had been a Soviet-perpetrated series of massacres, and that all of the claims about that the Germans were responsible when the massacres were disclosed in 1943 were false. However, because of wartime exigencies, that is the temporary alliance that had been formed with the Soviet Union, Western governments did not press the issue at the time and did not expose the lies for what they were, even though they were well aware that they were false. There was so much physical and circumstantial evidence that the crimes had been perpetrated by Soviet troops that there wasn't any doubt. There were perhaps one or two officials in the U.S. government very sympathetic to the Soviet Union who tried to argue against, but overwhelmingly the opinion was that it was a Soviet massacre. And unfortunately, because of the wartime alliance, that wasn't made clear at the time.
So this was the inconvenient truth that was only able to fully come into light when the political atmosphere has changed in a way that allowed it to become commonly known and discussed without the need to actually care for what the other side, namely the Soviet Union, would have to say about it. Now, David Engels, when thinking about this, we also need to remember that apart from the reluctance of the Western allies to investigate the issue, we also had an active disinformation campaign on the part of the Soviet authorities and the communist authorities in general. Can you tell us more about this?
Yeah, we shouldn't forget that even after the war, large parts of the Western European intellectuals were very clearly on the leftist side of the political chessboard. Think about people like Sartre, who were tremendously influential, and so I think he's a brilliant example of an intellectual who had all the keys of understanding the atrocities of Stalinism and indeed of communism, and didn't want to acknowledge them until the very last moment, because he really believed that even though Stalinism may be some form of accident of communism, still the idea of socialism or communism would be a good idea. And I think that is very representative of this, let's say, self-blinding of many Western elites when it came to Stalinism, to atrocities like Katyn. And I fear very strongly that today there are still elements like that are at work. Still many Western elites are convinced that, well, Russian communism was perhaps an accident, but that the general idea of communism, of socialism, is still something that is good, so that even massacres should be understood as errors in a system that in itself is quite positive. And I fear that is a key of understanding even today why many leftist intellectuals and media, even in France, in Germany and elsewhere, are still sympathetic with Russia, even today in the Ukrainian context.
And obviously, this forms a part of the broader phenomenon of Russia understanders who do not rely as much on the historical issues, are trying to sell the message that even what Russia is doing today is somehow justified, or that the Western media are actually distorting the truth, which naturally we know this is all a part of this ongoing campaign. Now, Paweł Żurkowski, when you're looking at the aftermath of the Katyn massacre today, do you think that the message is clear enough for members of the public today, not only when it comes to the dark legacy of communism, but also to something that must have driven these people down there, not just the decision makers, but also the Soviet troops to commit those crimes? I mean, we're seeing something that we can call it perhaps something that parallels those crimes to the extent that we can use parallels in history, because this might be unreliable in the long run. But we're seeing that today in Ukraine. Do you believe that Katyn is something that we can look at today and essentially see the origins of the phenomena that we're experiencing all those decades later?
I think that many people throughout the relatively quiet time forgot that the Katyn massacre took place, and today many people can't recognize or imagine the crime on that scale. It is for them. It is quite unimaginable, and they are very surprised seeing the messages from the Ukraine. However, the Katyn massacre should be a warning that nevertheless, the past of the time, such things could happen again and again, just according to the political or political requirements. I think that it is very, very important, like here in Warsaw, in our museum, our branch, the Katyn Museum, should popularize, as it is good word for it, the history of the Katyn massacre, the reasons, the proceedings, and the effect of this, that for all the Polish people or the other nations, that the situation can repeat in any time.
And it is a situation that is repeating itself in Ukraine. Obviously, the details are different, but arguably the mechanisms, the totalitarian mechanisms driving these crimes are still there. Now, Mark Kramer, do you believe that it is possible to eradicate this sort of thinking, to get a society that has been infected by this sort of mental virus, should we say, perhaps something that is influencing the collective mentality to endorse genocide or war crimes, if not actively participating. And we know that some people do actively participate, as they did during World War II. Is it possible to do that without a process that has taken place, say, in Nazi Germany, which necessarily required the defeat of that country and certain procedures being put in place? To put it simply, do you think that Russia has a chance at reconciliation, or should we say at a successful quest for justice and making sure that these mechanisms are finally put to rest and do not repeat themselves again? Because so far we've seen that they do have a tendency to come back within our time frame every now and then.
Yes, all very important questions. So let me deal with them as briefly as I can, given the time constraints. Is that just before Katyn, that is from 1930, July 1937 through September 1938, so a couple of years before the massacres in Poland, before the war began, Soviet troops were sent, Soviet NKVD units were sent around the Soviet Union to murder hundreds of thousands of people. In that 16 months, they murdered more than 800,000 people, ostensibly executed as traitors to the homeland. So if you have a government that is willing to murder that many of its own citizens, it's not that big a leap to go to Katyn, where you're murdering other, citizens of other countries, and that's why the atrocious behavior that has been evident in Russian troops nowadays goes back to that pattern of the Stalinist era, for which no one was held accountable. There were never any kind of Nuremberg-style tribunals set up after the Soviet Union disintegrated. For a little while, say 30-odd years ago, 35 years ago, I was somewhat hopeful that maybe someone would be held accountable for the Stalinist crimes in what was still the Soviet Union at that point. There was a great deal of public interest in the Stalin era, and publications were coming out and people would line up to buy them. But all of that dissipated after the Soviet Union ended. And even though Yeltsin was the one who did release the documents showing that Stalin ordered the massacre, Stalin and Beria ordered the massacres that took place in and around Katyn, nonetheless, all of the other crimes there was no attempt to make compensation for that, and all of the other terrible atrocities that occurred during the Stalin era went completely unaccounted for. So in that sense, I see a long pattern of ingrained behavior in which atrocious crimes are not only tolerated, but even rewarded to a certain extent. And that's why we see the latest iteration of it in the Russia-Ukraine war.
David Engels, do you believe that Russia is now condemned to live without memory, or to live with a memory that has been selectively edited by the authorities? I mean, the Memorial Society, which has long been tracking down the victims and the perpetrators of Stalinist crimes and making all that public, I mean, they were effectively outlawed. The Putin regime, using a variety of laws, has managed to silence this organization, forcing it to formally disband, operating under many different names and guises, but still being essentially hounded by the authorities. So they have no chance to operate as effectively as they did. Do you believe that this is a fate that Russia will be facing for a long time to come, essentially having its collective memory wiped clean and then repopulated with a different version of history written by the authorities?
That is absolutely a legitimate question. I think all of that depends, of course, how the war will turn out. Will there be some form of defeat for Putin that could then effectively lead to some form of political upheaval and perhaps a chance of redefining Russia's past? Or will we continue in this post-Stalinian idealization of Russian history from beginning to end, with a special focus on the virtue of cruelty. I think this will depend on it. But of course, as you stated, there's an enormous difference between the memory work as it has been done in Spain, for example, in Italy, in Germany, obviously after the war, after the end of totalitarianism, and in Russia, where all of this is absolutely missing. And I fear that another point that would be very important would be the pressure, or would have been before the war, a certain pressure from the Western European states. And unfortunately, as a Belgian, I have to confess that many of my compatriots in Belgium are absolutely unaware of the history of Eastern Europe, and especially, of course, of Polish history and Katyn. I would say that 99 out of 100 people you would meet in the street in Brussels or in Paris would never have heard in their entire life about Katyn. They have no dimension. They have some vague idea about perhaps Stalinist massacres and so forth. But in order to enforce also in Russia a change of awareness, the West also would have to start to be interested in the history of this region. And that is still missing. And I think that is one, of course, of the responsibilities also of today's Poland, of making its neighbors aware of its own history and of all the wounds this history has caused also in its own remembrance tissue, and also about that this is one of the reasons also of the attitude of Poland towards Russia, and the key for understanding what is happening between Poland, between Ukraine, between Russia, and between Belarus.
Paweł Żurkowski, do you think that paradoxically, and of course it is a tragic coincidence, but the war in Ukraine has opened this window of opportunity for people to become interested because they have a reason. They are hearing about Ukraine in the news, they are hearing about the region in the news, so they might be more inclined to take a look at some more details concerning the region's current affairs, but also its history. Do you think that we're ready to exploit this particular moment in time to create our own narratives, to perhaps abolish some of the false narratives that were built up by the communists and by the regime currently in place in Russia?
Decisively. It should be stressed, and many people like young people in Poland are now interested in the military service, for example, and I think that they will be interested in the background of the today's events. And the Katyn massacre history of fate of the Polish officers, forest servicemen and policemen, because they are all of them were the victims of the massacre. Is this right interest for them to get the knowledge of it? And this is a kind of an experience, and it is easier for them to adopt this truth because they have the real examples from Ukraine today.
Indeed, Ukraine is this sort of ongoing lesson that we're all participating in. Now, we are coming to a close, slowly but surely, of our discussion. So one quick question to all of you gentlemen, starting with Mark Kramer. Do you believe that in a couple of years' time we'll be seeing a different Central and Eastern Europe in a positive sense, that the Russian threat will be gone in the end?
A great deal of that will depend, in fact, maybe all of it will depend on the outcome of the war. There are both good outcomes and bad outcomes. The good outcome would be one in which Ukraine would win decisively, would also not engage in violent retribution, which I think is a real prospect and shouldn't be underestimated. That there are a lot of people in, say, Donbass and in certainly in Crimea, who were complicit in Russia's occupation. And what I wouldn't want to see happen would be that the Ukrainian government would begin taking violent retribution against them. There has to be some sort of accountability. But so that would be one outcome in which Ukraine wins decisively. The other outcome would be one in which there is no clear victor in it, that there is some sort of settlement reached. And I think that would just be a prelude to the next war, because the Russian government has shown that it is unwilling to comply with the commitments it takes on in international agreements. And so
there is a risk of fragile peace. And David Engels, do you think that this is what we might be facing? A fragile peace, perhaps brokered by China or other countries of the global south, but one that will not last?
I think most of what is important has already been said. I guess that only a change of regime in Russia can bring any fundamental difference in the political situation or the geopolitical situation of Eastern Europe. And I fear that a change of regime without some form of defeat will be impossible. And so we are facing, one way or the other, only degrees of bad outcomes of this war. There is no good outcome, I fear, and there is only one winner of this war, and that is China, one way or the other.
So that is a sobering assessment there. And at this point, we need to end our discussion. Hopefully, we'll be able to come back to the topic in the near future. Paweł Żurkowski, David Engels, and Mark Kramer were our guests tonight here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your expertise.
Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation.
And you're watching TVP World. Please stay with us for more latest news and updates. I'm Jonasz Lewiński. Bye for now.